So, chapter one gave us a simplified picture, essentially, of what social research is and some of the reasons why individuals do research in general. What we're trying to do then in chapter two is then talk about the ways in which social research is organized. The one that we might immediately think of is the distinction between qualitative or non-numeric and quantitative, numeric. But then we can also think of it as distinctions between experimental versus non-experimental social research, or case study based social research versus cross-case based social research. And so those are kind of the themes that we're going to explore in this chapter. Is what are the major distinctions or types of social research that is done. So if we look at one of the major distinctions here, it would be when we start to think of things like the use and the audience for the research. What we do is we organize research along 5 dimensions, and this use and audience of research is the first major organizing principle for research. And essentially, we have a distinction between basic and applied research. Now, in basic research, this is essentially academic research or pure research that, for some, might not be seen as having very little impact on the world. It can be research that's used to support or refute a theory that's seen in a textbook. It can be used to outline a debate that other scholars are having. The problem with basic research is that it's often criticized, and perhaps a little bit too easily criticized, because outsiders or non-academics can sometimes see this as non-important research, or research that essentially deals with theoretical topics that have no impact on the rest of the world. And that obviously that is a little bit more of what's dealt with in applied research. In applied research, we're trying to address a specific concern. We're talking about practical solutions to concrete problems. So let me just give you an example of each of these then. So in basic research, I might say something like, I could look at things like, is it the case that, let me just give an example from economics, is it the case that central banks that make their own currency strong compared to other currencies, do those kinds of countries have more macroeconomic stability, right? In some sense, if your country's not doing that thing, why would you want to know whether you get more macroeconomic stability? It's not very specific to a specific country. It's not specific to a time period. An alternative that would be applied research would be me saying something like, should the United States, in order to achieve 2% economic growth, pursue a strong dollar policy? Now, what that does is it sets it up for answering that specific applied question. Problem would be, hey, we might not have strong enough economic growth around here. I want stronger economic growth. How do I get it? Maybe I get it by having a strong dollar in the country. So in the applied research, now if we're just dealing with the applied research, there's essentially 3 different types of applied research. There's evaluation research, action research, and social impact research. In the evaluation research, this is probably the most widely used, right? We're looking at, and this is especially widely used by those who are social scientists. I'm looking at, is a policy working well? Is a program working well? This type of research has been probably, and I think you see a little bit of a discussion of this in the book as well, is that this kind of research became increasingly popular when the government in the 1960s started to expand the number of social programs that existed, and then also wanted to make sure that they were getting their money's worth. So this would be something like, is the Medicare program? Is that allowing elderly individuals to have less medical debt? What's it doing to how long they live? If I invest more in hospitals in a particular community, do health results improve? Does the population continue to grow? And of this evaluation research, we actually see two different kinds. There's both the formative feedback type of evaluation research and then the summative form of the evaluation research. Now, even though the evaluation research is the most popular, we then see the action research also playing an important role. What the action research does is it looks at knowledge as power, or at least as a form of power. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get new knowledge while I'm actually using my existing knowledge to achieve a specific purpose. So what that does is it allows me then to build on the existing work that's been done. It seems a little bit less revolutionary or a little bit less like let's tear down the walls. Rather, it seems a little bit more constructive. And then the third type we have here is the social impact research. This is important. This is quite important. I mean, I can think of many examples, especially in economics, where we see social impact assessments. And this would be things like, should we raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour? Well, I'd want to know, what are the consequences? Is unemployment going to go up? Is economic growth going to suffer? Are we going to see inflation? And we can think of other things too, right? Should I pass a law that limits how much gasoline people can buy during a week, right? We can see these, I'd want to know, what does the social impact or economic impact of a change being made. Now, how do we, what kind of tools do we use to conduct this applied research? There's both the needs assessment and the cost-benefit analysis. Let me start with the cost-benefit analysis. Only because I'm an economist and we use this one almost exclusively. As the term implies, it's essentially a comparison of the costs and the benefits of an activity being taken. And what you want to make sure is that the benefits outweigh the cost, or at least that you're aware of what the costs and the benefits are to a decision being made. If I decide to make seat belts a mandatory equipment in cars, how much is that going to cost? How many lives will it save, right? Now I can make an informed decision about whether I should require cars to have that. One recent area actually where we saw this was almost all new cars today have what's called electronic stability. It turns out that this little thing just kind of at least reduces the likelihood that your car will just like tip over if you make a hard turn or if the roads are a little bit icy. And it turns out for this, $20 part, $30 part that's added to all cars, that many lives are saved. So we could certainly say that the costs, right? It certainly costs something more to install this extra part, but the benefits far outweigh those costs. And then the second type of tool that's used in applied research would be the needs assessment. This is when we try to gather at least some descriptive information that tells me about at least the kind of the need that exists. What's the magnitude of that need, the scope of that need, what's the severity of that need, and then how do I then start to try to satisfy that need or meet that need. And beyond that simple distinction between basic and applied, then we also kind of need to deal with three different issues. The first issue being the form of knowledge. And in the form of knowledge, essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at and there's some overlap, but the knowledge that exists instrumentally versus reflexively. Instrumentally, what we do is we see that the knowledge is then narrowly focused on just answering a very narrow or very focused basic or applied research question. Right? Me stating simply a simple research question that I then have an answer to, yes or no. Reflexive knowledge is much more broad. It's examining the assumptions that are being used in our knowledge, it's testing those assumptions, thinking about alternative scenarios where those assumptions perhaps no longer exist. And what we see is that the type of knowledge that I then focus on forming then becomes, part of it then becomes determined by who my audience is. Am I trying to talk to other academics? Well, then I'm probably more likely to use reflexive knowledge. Otherwise, if I'm the public activist or a very general practitioner, perhaps I would focus a little bit more on the reflexive knowledge. And again, then the narrow practitioner would focus on the instrumental knowledge that exists. So when we look at how much, when we look at research and we try to then understand the context that goes into creating research, one thing that we would think about is how much autonomy or freedom does the researcher have? What kind of restrictions are placed on the results that they can achieve? Whether those are restrictions in terms of monetary resources, geographical, restrictions, or simply, can they publish what they are actually writing about or communicate to others what the results were? And where you see perhaps the most restrictions would be in social research that is commissioned, unless, of course, it's commissioned by the government. And outside of the military, most of the time, at least for the government, research, you have to publish it, or at least any member of the public can request those research results. Otherwise, if the social research is commissioned by a firm, oftentimes that firm might not let you reveal the results. They'll finance your activities quite generously, but you will find that the research will only be seen by those internal to the company. And so then we see this broken down in terms of the forms of knowledge that exist, and the reflexive, instrumental, and breaking down that instrumental into whether it's commissioned or autonomous, and then looking at the types of audiences that exist. And these would be the general categories that we have for those audiences. Now, the second kind of the second kind of organization for research would be the exploratory research versus the descriptive research versus the explanatory research. So here in the exploratory research, what we see is that research has a purpose to examine something that has been little understood up to this point. What exploratory research needs is essentially someone who's creative, someone who's quite open-minded. And then the steps that are then followed by that person who's the exploratory researcher is that that's a person who has a basic understanding of the facts and a general question, but then what they do is they develop their research along these lines, right? That they formulate the question for future research, generating new ideas, look at the feasibility of the future research, and then develop their measurements. In the second kind of research, we have the descriptive research. And in the descriptive research, what I'm trying to do here essentially is paint a picture. And I could be using either qualitative or quantitative methods to paint that picture. I'm looking at a very specific, detailed situation, right? So in here, I'm limiting my research by a time period. I'm limiting it by geography. I'm limiting it by, let's say, age group of the participants. I'm trying to be quite descriptive of this highly focused topic. And then finally, in the explanatory research, what I'm trying to do is just generally explain why certain events occur. And I'm testing the hypothesis about why I think a certain event exists. And then I'm testing that theory. And then linking that, that specific situation to the general theory. And does that specific situation then reinforce or go against what the theory tells me should be happening. And so then you see this taken from the book. Then you see this in box 2.2, my explanatory, descriptive, and explanatory research. Now, a third way of thinking about this, about the distinctions of research. So we've done basic and applied, and then explanatory, exploratory, and descriptive. Now we have the distinction between within or across cases. And in the case study research, what we're trying to do is look in, have an in-depth examination of all the information about a few cases for one period. So what I'm doing is looking at things like the 6 strengths of this case study research method would be that I have some conceptual validity. That means that I'm able to kind of flesh out and identify certain concepts. Another strength would be that this research has some heuristic impact. That means that it helps essentially or aids me in developing new theories. Case study research is also useful because it actually provides me a way to identify causal mechanisms, right? Can I actually make connections between things? Do I see a causal relationship rather than just a correlation between separate events? What the case study research method also allows me to do is it allows me to trace out how do processes exist? How do I go from one step to another? How can I take this incredibly complex picture of how things exist and try to break down that complexity into something much simpler? The case study research method also allows me to engage in some calibration. That means that I can essentially adjust some of the measures of my concepts to something that is dependable, something that I can measure, something that my mind can wrap itself around. And then finally, the case study research method, the other benefit of that method would be that it provides me some way to elaborate holistically. That means elaborate essentially on the entire situation. Now, in the across case research method, what we're doing here is we're looking at quantitative research, and in fact, quite a large amount of quantitative research. And what I'm doing is comparing and contrasting select features across these cases. So an example of that would be something like I could look at economic growth in 2 different countries and try to compare and contrast certain elements of that growth and try to outline the relationships that exist across those. Now, a fourth way that we can understand the differences in research, the major types of research, would be whether I'm doing the research at a single or a multiple points in time. So the book has these sorts of pictures, and I think the pictures are actually somewhat useful and illustrative for helping you remember the types of cross-sectional research that exists. So in cross-sectional research, what I'm doing is I'm looking at a collection of people at a single moment in time. And so here you see lots of different types of individuals existing, and in fact, one having a dog, at a single moment in time, February of 2011. In the time series research, what I'm trying to do here is I'm looking at information from many cases across more than one unit of time. So here I see a 4 different decade time period here. And I'm looking at then the birth rate and how it's changing between those time periods. Now the individuals are all different, right? In 1950, it looks like there's a farmer and a businessman. 1970, it looks like there's a worried husband and a mother changing a baby. 1990, looks like there's a mailman, and it's either a baseball player or someone breaking something with a bat. And then in 2010, it's a woman with a grocery cart and a guy who's going to do something with a golf club. I don't know what he's going to do. All different individuals. With lots of different circumstances that exist across lots of different time periods. But we're looking at one constant. We're looking at the birth rate across those different time periods. Alternatively, I could engage in some panel research. And what I'm doing here is I'm looking at the exact same people, but I'm looking at those exact same people across different time periods. Here, 3 different time periods, 1985, 95, 2005, but the individuals are exactly the same. And I'm just looking at how are their perceptions of their ability to develop a meaningful philosophy of life and their ability to be well off financially, how are those things changing over time? Then I could engage in the cohort study. In the cohort study, I'm looking at some individuals who've shared some kind of experience, right? So in this case, I could look at, here I have 2 couples that were both married in 1962. That's the thing that they share. They would need something else as well, so I guess you could say it would be, maybe you could even just say heterosexual or same-sex couples, or same race couples that married in 1962. And then I look over time and see how are things changing. Apparently in 2002 they are dancing. I don't know why. And then the 5th and final way that we think about the distinctions of research would engage in the data collection techniques. In the data collection techniques, what I'm looking at is how is the quantitative data collected. One way would be that I conduct experiments with a small set of individuals. Or perhaps I engage in a survey where I question a large number of individuals. Or perhaps I even engage in some non-reactive research where the people who are being, where data is being collected from them, that they're not even aware that they are being studied. Now, the alternative would be that I could engage in some qualitative research. And in this qualitative research, I could do things such as field research, where I'm directly observing what's going on and recording notes about what I see going on. Or I could engage in some historical comparative research, where I'm looking at events that had occurred in the historical past. So what I want you to then think about as you're thinking about this chapter and as you're completing or have just completed your first research assignment, at least the proposal that you'll be sending to me, is start to think about where you exist in these major types of social research. Start to identify it, because then when you're creating that proposal, you're using those kinds of terms to talk about what you're doing.